Spring 1990, Asheville, North Carolina. On a mild Saturday afternoon in April 1990, the bustling Asheville City Market carried on with its usual weekend rhythm. Vendors arranged their wares while customers moved between stalls, selecting fresh produce, handcrafted goods, and local specialties. Among the most popular stands was the honey booth operated by Samuel Thompson, a 47-year-old beekeeper who had become a fixture at the market over the previous 12 years. Samuel's reputation extended beyond simply selling honey. He educated customers about beekeeping practices, explained the differences between wildflower and clover honey, and shared stories about his apiaries scattered across the mountain regions surrounding Asheville. Regular customers knew they could trust the quality of his products, and many would wait specifically for his booth rather than purchase from other vendors. So glad to have you here. Comment your city so I can bring cases from your region and also know where you're watching me from. That particular Saturday began like any other. Samuel arrived at 5:30 in the morning to set up his display, arranging jars of golden honey in neat rows, each labeled with the harvest date and floral source. His wife Catherine had helped him load the truck the evening before, ensuring they had adequate inventory for what promised to be a busy spring market day. Witnesses later recalled seeing Samuel engaged in conversation with an unfamiliar man around mid-morning. The individual appeared to be in his late 30s or early 40s, dressed casually in jeans and a work jacket. Several vendors noticed the conversation seemed intense, though not openly hostile. The stranger gestured repeatedly toward the parking area, as if trying to convince Samuel of something. Around 11 o'clock, Samuel did something completely out of character. He began packing up his booth 3 hours earlier than usual, leaving behind several jars of honey and the cash box containing the morning's earnings. A neighboring vendor asked if everything was all right, but Samuel simply mentioned needing to check on something urgent at one of his apiaries. He promised to return within an hour to collect his remaining inventory and proceeds. That hour passed, then another and another. By closing time at 4 in the afternoon, Samuel had not returned. His booth stood partially dismantled, honey jars still lined up on the table, money still in the unlocked cash box. Fellow vendors grew concerned, but assumed perhaps a family emergency had arisen. Catherine Thompson expected her husband home by 6 that evening. When 7 o'clock arrived without any word, she began calling friends and family. By 8, she contacted the Asheville Police Department to report Samuel missing. Officers initially treated it as a routine missing person case, suggesting he might have experienced vehicle trouble in a remote area without phone access. The following morning, a county sheriff's deputy discovered Samuel's pickup truck abandoned on a narrow dirt road leading into the Pisgah National Forest, approximately 15 miles from the market. The vehicle was unlocked, keys still in the ignition, but showed no signs of struggle or foul play. Samuel's wallet remained in the glove compartment, along with a thermos of coffee and a half-eaten sandwich. Search teams combed the surrounding forest for 3 days, utilizing tracking dogs and volunteer searchers familiar with the mountainous terrain. They found nothing. No clothing, no footprints leading away from the vehicle, no indication of where Samuel might have gone or why he would have abandoned his truck in such a location. Investigators interviewed dozens of people. Market vendors provided statements about the mysterious conversation with the unknown man. Catherine supplied information about Samuel's daily routines, his apiaries, and any recent concerns he might have mentioned. She recalled that in recent weeks, Samuel had seemed troubled by something related to his business, though he had been vague about the details. Detectives discovered that Samuel had been taking notes about irregularities he had observed in the local honey market. Several new vendors had appeared over the previous year, selling honey at prices significantly below market value. Samuel suspected the honey was being adulterated, mixed with corn syrup or imported products labeled as local. He had mentioned wanting to investigate further and possibly report his findings to agricultural authorities. This line of inquiry opened potential motives beyond a simple disappearance. If Samuel had uncovered illegal activity, he might have become a threat to those profiting from fraudulent practices. However, without concrete evidence or identifiable suspects, the investigation stalled. Weeks became months. The case remained open but inactive, joining the growing files of unsolved disappearances. Catherine maintained hope, keeping Samuel's honey business operating with help from other local beekeepers. She refused to believe her husband had simply walked away from his life. The Thompson children, Michael and Emily, grew up with the shadow of their father's disappearance hanging over their family. They learned to navigate questions from classmates and neighbors, endured the whispered speculation, and watched their mother's unwavering determination to find answers. As 1990 turned to 1991, then 1992, the community's attention gradually shifted to other matters. Samuel Thompson became another unsolved mystery in Asheville's history, his face appearing occasionally on anniversary news segments about cold cases, but generating no new leads. The market continued without him. His booth space was eventually taken by another vendor. Life moved forward, as it always does, leaving behind only questions and the fading hope that someday, somehow, the truth about what happened that April afternoon would finally emerge from the shadows where it had been hiding for so long. Yet in the dense forests surrounding Asheville, in a place no one thought to search, evidence of Samuel's fate was slowly being preserved in the most unexpected way imaginable, waiting patiently for someone to recognize what nature had protected for more than 3 decades. 1990-2023, Asheville, North Carolina. The years following Samuel Thompson's disappearance transformed his family in ways that extended far beyond the immediate grief of loss. Catherine Thompson faced the difficult reality of raising 2 children while operating a business her husband had built from nothing. The honey operation became both a memorial and a burden, a constant reminder of the man who had vanished without explanation. In the early years, Catherine held firmly to the belief that Samuel would return. She maintained his apiaries exactly as he had left them, following his meticulous records about hive locations, harvest schedules, and customer preferences. Local beekeepers, moved by her situation, volunteered their expertise to help manage the colonies. What began as temporary assistance gradually evolved into a permanent arrangement, with 3 experienced apiarists rotating responsibilities for the hives scattered across the mountain properties Samuel had leased. Michael and Emily Thompson grew into adolescence carrying the weight of unanswered questions. Michael, who had been 9 years old when his father disappeared, developed an intense interest in investigative journalism. He spent hours at the public library researching missing persons cases, studying patterns and outcomes, searching for any parallel that might illuminate what had happened to Samuel. Emily, 7 at the time of the disappearance, channeled her confusion into academic achievement, eventually pursuing a degree in criminal justice with the explicit goal of understanding how cases went cold and what could be done to revive them. The Asheville Police Department maintained Samuel's case file, but with no new evidence and no credible sightings, active investigations ceased after the first year. The file was reviewed periodically, particularly when new detectives joined the department or when advances in forensic technology offered potential avenues for re-examination. Each review reached the same conclusion. Without additional evidence or witness testimony, the case remained at a dead end. In 1995, a prison inmate claimed to have information about Samuel's disappearance, suggesting the honey vendor had been killed over a business dispute. Detectives drove 3 hours to interview the man, only to discover his story contained verifiable inaccuracies about basic facts of the case. The lead dissolved into nothing, another false hope in a series of disappointments. The year 2000 brought renewed attention when a documentary filmmaker producing a series about unsolved Appalachian mysteries featured Samuel's case. The program aired nationally, generating dozens of tips phoned into the Asheville Police Department. Investigators followed each lead methodically. A reported sighting in Tennessee proved to be a case of mistaken identity. An anonymous caller suggesting Samuel had fled to start a new life in Florida provided details that didn't align with his character or circumstances. A psychic offered to locate the body for a fee, a proposal the department declined. Catherine participated in the documentary reluctantly, sitting for an interview in the living room where Samuel's photographs still covered the mantelpiece. She spoke about her husband's dedication to his craft, his integrity in business dealings, and his love for his family. The segment ended with her standing at the market booth, now operated by others, expressing her enduring hope for answers. Michael Thompson graduated from college in 2003 and began working as a reporter for a regional newspaper. He wrote extensively about cold cases, always returning to his father's disappearance as a touchstone for understanding how investigations faltered and families coped with ambiguity. His articles caught the attention of advocacy groups supporting families of missing persons, and he became a frequent speaker at conferences dedicated to improving investigation protocols. In 2010, Emily completed her graduate degree in forensic psychology and joined a nonprofit organization that provided support services to families dealing with unsolved disappearances. Her work brought her into contact with dozens of cases similar to her father's, each one reinforcing her understanding of how devastating unresolved loss could be. She advocated for legislative changes that would mandate periodic review of cold cases and ensure families received updates even when no progress had been made. The 20th anniversary of Samuel's disappearance in 2010 prompted another wave of media coverage. Local television stations ran retrospective segments. Newspapers published feature articles examining how the case had affected the Thompson family and the broader Asheville community. The coverage generated a few new tips, but none led to substantive developments. Catherine had aged visibly over those 2 decades, though her determination had not diminished. She still operated the honey business, though on a smaller scale. The market booth had long since been surrendered, but she maintained a small retail operation from her home, selling to loyal customers who had known Samuel and wanted to support his family. The apiaries had been reduced from 12 locations to 4, a more manageable number for the aging beekeepers who continued volunteering their expertise. In 2015, advances in DNA analysis and database technology prompted the Asheville Police Department to conduct a comprehensive review of all cold cases from the previous 3 decades. Samuel Thompson's file received fresh attention. Investigators re-interviewed witnesses whose memories had faded, but whose statements might reveal new significance when examined with contemporary understanding of criminal behavior. They submitted evidence samples for updated forensic analysis, hoping that genetic material too degraded for 1990s technology might yield results with modern methods. The review consumed 6 months and considerable resources, but ultimately produced no breakthrough. The detective assigned to the re-examination concluded that without discovering new physical evidence or witness testimony, the case would remain unsolved. The file was returned to cold case storage, its contents now digitized, but no more illuminating than they had been 25 years earlier. Catherine turned 75 in 2018. Michael and Emily had established their own families, giving her 5 grandchildren who had never met their grandfather except through photographs and stories. She began considering what would happen to Samuel's business after her death, whether maintaining it served any purpose beyond keeping his memory alive. That same year, Christopher Hayes, a name that would later become significant in the investigation, died of natural causes at age 72. His obituary described him as a retired agricultural products distributor who had been active in regional beekeeping associations. The notice mentioned no family and requested no services. His death passed without notice from anyone connected to Samuel Thompson's case. By 2020, the market where Samuel had maintained his booth for 12 years had undergone complete renovation. New vendors occupied the stalls, few of whom had any memory of the honey seller who had vanished 3 decades earlier. The market management maintained a small historical display featuring photographs of longtime vendors, including one image of Samuel standing proudly beside his honey jars, his smile frozen in a moment of prosperity and contentment that would never return. Michael Thompson published a book in 2021 examining unsolved disappearances in the American South, dedicating an entire chapter to his father's case. The book received modest attention, generating a few speaking invitations and radio interviews, but produced no new information about what had happened that April afternoon in 1990. Catherine continued her routine, maintaining the remaining apiaries with help from the faithful volunteers who had become like family over the decades. She visited the spot where Samuel's truck had been found, a pilgrimage she made several times each year, standing on the lonely forest road and wondering what had drawn him there and where he had gone. As 2023 approached, the case had been cold for 33 years. The Asheville Police Department file remained open technically, but no detective had actively worked on it in nearly a decade. The Thompson family had learned to live with uncertainty, building lives around an absence that could neither be filled nor forgotten. Then, on an October morning in 2023, a beekeeper named David Mitchell received a call about a problematic hive that needed removal from an abandoned property in the mountains outside Asheville. He had no way of knowing that what he was about to discover would finally break open a mystery that had confounded investigators and haunted a family for more than 3 decades, revealing a truth that had been literally preserved in wax and honey, waiting patiently for someone to recognize its significance. October 2023, Pisgah National Forest Area, North Carolina. David Mitchell had been working as a professional beekeeper for 15 years, having learned the craft from his grandfather, who had maintained apiaries throughout the Appalachian region. At 38 years old, he had developed a reputation for handling difficult hive removals, particularly those involving structures where bees had established colonies in inconvenient or dangerous locations. The call came on a Tuesday morning from a property management company handling the sale of a rural parcel that had been abandoned for several years. The land included a small wooden cabin that had fallen into severe disrepair. Prospective buyers had noticed significant bee activity around the structure, and inspection revealed that a large colony had taken up residence inside. The management company needed the hive removed before proceeding with the sale. David drove 40 minutes into the mountains, following increasingly narrow roads until he reached the property. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by dense forest, its roof partially collapsed and windows long since broken out. Vegetation had begun reclaiming the structure, with vines climbing the exterior walls and saplings pushing through gaps in the foundation. Approaching the cabin cautiously, David assessed the situation through the broken doorway. Bees moved in and out through multiple entry points, their flight patterns indicating the colony had been established for considerable time. The sound of thousands of insects filled the interior, a low thrumming that spoke to the hive's substantial size. David suited up in his protective gear and entered the structure carefully, aware that disturbed bees could become aggressive. What he encountered inside exceeded anything he had anticipated. The bees had constructed an enormous network of comb throughout what had once been the cabin's main room, utilizing the exposed wall studs and ceiling joists as framework for their elaborate wax architecture. But it was what the bees had incorporated into their construction that caused David to pause. Honeycomb had been built around objects that clearly had no natural place in a bee colony. Fragments of fabric were visible, completely encased in layers of beeswax that had accumulated over many seasons. A watch was partially visible, its metal band extending from a section of comb like a bizarre decoration. David had encountered unusual items in hives before. Bees sometimes built around objects they found in their environment, but something about this discovery felt different, almost deliberate in how the insects had preserved these items within their wax structures. He carefully photographed everything with his phone, documenting the hive's unusual features before beginning any removal process. As he examined the comb more closely, David noticed what appeared to be papers embedded in the wax near the floor level. The bees had sealed the documents within multiple layers of their construction, creating a natural preservation chamber that had protected the materials from moisture and decay. The papers appeared to contain handwriting, though reading them would require careful extraction. David's initial instinct was to simply remove the hive and dispose of the unusual contents as debris, but his years of experience told him this situation warranted further attention. The watch, the fabric, the documents, these items suggested human presence in a location that appeared to have been abandoned for decades. The cabin showed no signs of recent habitation, yet the objects sealed within the hive seemed too deliberately placed to be random debris. He contacted the property management company to inquire about the cabin's history. The representative knew only that the parcel had been purchased at a tax auction 5 years earlier after the previous owner had died without heirs. Records showed the property had been privately owned since the 1970s, but had fallen into disuse sometime in the late 1980s or early 1990s. No one from the management company had entered the cabin prior to the recent buyer inspection. David made a decision that would prove crucial. Rather than proceeding with the hive removal, he called the Buncombe County Sheriff's Department to report his findings. He explained that he had discovered personal items sealed within a bee colony in an abandoned cabin, items that might have significance beyond simple debris. A deputy arrived within an hour, initially skeptical that a beekeeper's discovery warranted law enforcement attention. However, upon viewing David's photographs and hearing his description of the scene, the deputy's demeanor changed. He radioed for a detective to respond to the location, indicating that the situation might indeed be more significant than a routine hive removal. Detective Rebecca Anderson arrived as afternoon shadows began lengthening across the forest clearing. At 45 years old, she had worked in the sheriff's department for 22 years, with the last decade spent investigating cold cases and unsolved crimes. She listened carefully as David explained what he had found and why it had concerned him enough to contact authorities. Anderson entered the cabin with David, who pointed out the specific areas where objects were visible within the honeycomb. She immediately recognized that proper evidence collection would require careful coordination between law enforcement and someone with David's expertise in safely dismantling the hive without destroying what it had preserved. The detective photographed everything extensively, documenting the hive's structure and the visible items before any removal began. She noted the watch particularly, recognizing that such an item could potentially be traced through manufacturer records or identifying marks. The fabric appeared to be clothing material, possibly from a shirt or jacket, though its original color had been obscured by years of wax accumulation. Anderson contacted the Sheriff's Department forensic team, explaining that she needed specialists who could assist in carefully extracting evidence from an unusual preservation environment. Within 2 hours, 3 forensic technicians arrived with equipment for documenting and collecting evidence from the scene. The process of carefully removing sections of honeycomb while preserving the encased items took several hours. David worked alongside the forensic team, using his knowledge of hive construction to identify which sections could be safely removed and which required more delicate handling. The bees, disturbed by the activity, became increasingly agitated, requiring breaks in the work to allow the colony to settle. As daylight faded, portable lights were brought in to continue the evidence collection. The watch was successfully extracted, its face still readable despite the wax coating. The fabric pieces were removed in sections, maintaining their encasement to preserve any potential trace evidence the wax might have protected. The documents proved most challenging. The bees had sealed them so thoroughly that separating paper from wax without damage would require laboratory conditions and specialized techniques. The entire section of comb containing the papers was carefully cut away and placed in evidence containers for transport to the forensic laboratory. By the time the evidence collection concluded, Anderson had filled 6 large evidence boxes with material removed from the hive. The items would be transported to the State Forensic Laboratory for detailed analysis, a process that could take weeks, given the unusual nature of the preservation and the need to avoid destroying what the bees had protected. David completed the hive removal the following day, relocating the colony to a safe location where they could rebuild away from the cabin. As he worked, he reflected on how a routine service call had transformed into something far more significant, though exactly what that significance might be remained unclear. Detective Anderson returned to her office with the evidence documentation, beginning the process of researching the property's history and cross-referencing her findings with unsolved cases from the region. The cabin's location, its abandonment timeline, and the nature of the items discovered suggested this was more than simple debris sealed by industrious insects. As she pulled up the database of cold cases from the past 4 decades, Anderson had no way of knowing she was about to connect her discovery to a disappearance that had devastated a family and baffled investigators for 33 years, a case that had gone cold for lack of physical evidence but was about to be broken open by the most unlikely of preservationists, a colony of honeybees that had sealed the truth in wax. November 2023, North Carolina State Forensic Laboratory. The evidence boxes from the cabin arrived at the State Forensic Laboratory on a Thursday morning, accompanied by Detective Anderson's detailed report describing the unusual circumstances of their discovery. The case was assigned to forensic specialist Jennifer Martinez, who had 20 years of experience processing evidence from cold cases and challenging preservation environments. Martinez began her examination with the watch, the most immediately identifiable item extracted from the hive. After carefully removing the layers of beeswax using specialized solvents that wouldn't damage potential trace evidence, she revealed a men's wristwatch with a stainless steel band and a face that had stopped at 3:15. The back of the watch case bore an engraving that would prove crucial to the investigation. The inscription read simply, "To Samuel, with love, Catherine, 1985. The name Samuel immediately triggered a search through missing persons databases. Martinez cross-referenced the name with cases from the Asheville area, given the proximity of the cabin to that city. Within minutes, she had identified a potential match. Samuel Thompson, reported missing in April 1990 from the Asheville City Market. Martinez contacted Detective Anderson immediately with her findings. Anderson pulled the Thompson case file, which had been digitized during the 2015 cold case review. The file contained photographs of Samuel taken shortly before his disappearance, including one clear image showing him wearing a watch that appeared identical to the one found in the hive. The connection sent the investigation in an entirely new direction. What had begun as a curious discovery by a beekeeper now appeared to be physical evidence related to a 33-year-old missing person case. Anderson contacted Catherine Thompson, now 80 years old, to inquire about the watch her husband had worn. Catherine confirmed she had given Samuel the watch for their anniversary in 1985, and that he had been wearing it the day he disappeared from the market. The forensic team proceeded with heightened urgency. The fabric pieces extracted from the hive were analyzed and determined to be fragments of a work shirt, the type Samuel had typically worn while operating his market booth. DNA testing was initiated, though the long preservation period made results uncertain. The documents sealed within the honeycomb required the most delicate handling. Laboratory technicians worked for days, carefully separating paper from wax, using temperature-controlled environments and specialized tools to avoid tearing the fragile materials. The papers proved to be handwritten notes, the ink faded but still legible in most sections. As the notes were pieced together, they revealed themselves to be detailed observations about irregularities Samuel had noticed in the local honey market. He had documented specific vendors, their pricing structures, and his suspicions about product adulteration. The notes included names, dates, and descriptions of transactions that Samuel believed were fraudulent. One name appeared repeatedly throughout the documents: Christopher Hayes, identified as a supplier who had been offering honey to local vendors at prices that made no economic sense unless the product was diluted or falsified. Samuel's notes indicated he had been collecting evidence to present to state agricultural inspectors, documenting a pattern of fraud he believed was damaging legitimate beekeepers and deceiving consumers. The notes also contained references to confrontations Samuel had experienced with individuals involved in what he termed the honey laundering operation. He described threats made against him, warnings to stop asking questions about product sources and quality testing. The final dated entry was from April 13, 1990, the day before his disappearance, mentioning a planned meeting with someone Samuel identified only as CH to discuss resolving the situation. Detective Anderson now had a potential motive for Samuel's disappearance and a clear suspect in Christopher Hayes. However, checking records revealed that Hayes had died in 2018, eliminating the possibility of prosecution for his direct involvement. Anderson needed to determine if others had participated in whatever had happened to Samuel Thompson, and whether any of those individuals were still alive. She initiated a comprehensive background investigation into Hayes's business activities in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Financial records, though old and partially incomplete, showed Hayes had operated a supply company that distributed honey and other apiary products to vendors throughout western North Carolina. The company had dissolved in 1995, 5 years after Samuel's disappearance, with Hayes claiming business difficulties as the reason for closure. Anderson interviewed former associates of Hayes, now elderly individuals who had worked in the regional beekeeping industry during the relevant period. Several recalled rumors about questionable product sources and pricing practices, but claimed they had no direct knowledge of fraudulent activities. One former vendor, granted anonymity, admitted that Hayes had pressured multiple people to participate in his operation, threatening to undercut their prices and drive them out of business if they refused to cooperate. The cabin where the hive had been discovered, was property records showed, had been owned by Hayes from 1978 until his death in 2018. The location was remote, accessed by unmarked forest roads that appeared on few maps. It was, Anderson realized, an ideal location for conducting business one wanted to keep private. With the watch confirmed as Samuel's, the clothing fragments showing DNA consistent with the Thompson family profile, and the documents establishing both motive and connection to Hayes, Anderson faced a crucial question. Were there human remains somewhere on or near the property that might provide definitive proof of what had happened to Samuel Thompson? She organized a comprehensive search of the cabin site and surrounding area. Cadaver dogs were brought in, along with ground-penetrating radar equipment and a team of forensic anthropologists trained in locating burial sites. The search focused initially on the cabin interior and the immediate clearing, then expanded into the surrounding forest. On the third day of searching, one of the cadaver dogs alerted to an area beneath the cabin's collapsed back porch. The ground-penetrating radar showed an anomaly consistent with disturbed soil approximately 4 feet below the surface. Forensic anthropologists began a careful excavation, removing layers of earth while screening every bit of material for evidence. The excavation revealed skeletal remains that had been buried in a shallow grave and subsequently protected from scavengers by the cabin's foundation structure. The bones were carefully documented in place before being removed for laboratory analysis. Preliminary examination indicated they were human remains, though determining identity and cause of death would require extensive forensic work. Detective Anderson stood at the excavation site as the final bones were removed, considering the path that had led to this moment. A beekeeper responding to a routine service call had discovered evidence that had survived 33 years through an extraordinary accident of nature. Bees, building their colony inside an abandoned cabin, had sealed items that connected directly to an unsolved disappearance, preserving them in wax until someone with the knowledge to recognize their significance came along. The remains were transported to the state medical examiner's office for complete analysis. DNA extraction and comparison would take several weeks, but Anderson felt confident they would confirm what the accumulated evidence already strongly suggested. Samuel Thompson had died in or near that cabin in April 1990, murdered by individuals who had then attempted to hide all evidence of their crime. What the killers could not have anticipated was that nature itself would become an archivist, that insects building their home would create a time capsule preserving the truth they had tried to bury. As Anderson prepared her reports and organized the evidence for eventual prosecution, she knew that somewhere in the accumulated records and witness statements lay the identities of everyone involved in Samuel Thompson's death, and at least one of them might still be alive to face justice for a crime committed more than 3 decades ago. December 2023, Asheville, North Carolina. The DNA analysis confirmed what Detective Anderson had anticipated. The skeletal remains discovered beneath the cabin belonged to Samuel Thompson. The medical examiner's report provided additional crucial information. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with being struck by a heavy object. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. With positive identification established, Anderson shifted her focus to building a prosecutable case against anyone still living who had participated in Samuel's murder. Christopher Hayes, the primary suspect based on the documentary evidence found in the hive, had died 5 years earlier, but Anderson suspected he had not acted alone. The detective returned to Hayes's business records with renewed purpose. Financial documents from his distribution company revealed a network of business relationships spanning the late 1980s and early 1990s. Hayes had maintained regular transactions with approximately 15 vendors and suppliers throughout the region. Most of these individuals were now deceased, or could demonstrate they had left the honey business before 1990. However, one name appeared with particular frequency in Hayes's records during the months leading up to Samuel's disappearance: Patrick Morgan, who had served as Hayes's business partner and co-owner of the distribution company. Records showed Morgan had sold his share of the business to Hayes in 1991, just 1 year after Samuel vanished, receiving a substantial payment that seemed inconsistent with the company's reported financial performance. Anderson located Patrick Morgan living in a retirement community in South Carolina. Now 68 years old, he had spent the decades since leaving the honey business working in various agricultural supply positions before retiring in 2020. She initiated surveillance while building her case, not wanting to alert Morgan to the investigation before having sufficient evidence to support charges. Simultaneously, Anderson pursued another investigative avenue. She tracked down former employees and associates of Hayes's distribution company, seeking anyone who might have witnessed or heard about events surrounding Samuel Thompson's disappearance. Most recalled little about the specific time period, but several mentioned that Hayes and Morgan had seemed particularly stressed during the spring of 1990. One former warehouse employee, now 73 years old, provided information that proved significant. He recalled that in late April 1990, Hayes and Morgan had unexpectedly closed the warehouse for several days, claiming they needed to conduct inventory reconciliation. When employees returned, they noticed that the company truck had been thoroughly cleaned, unusual given that the vehicle normally showed the dirt and debris typical of rural deliveries. The employee also remembered finding a pair of work gloves in a trash bin that appeared to have been partially burned. At the time, he had thought nothing of it, but the memory had persisted because the gloves had seemed perfectly usable aside from the fire damage. Anderson recognized that this detail, while not constituting direct evidence, suggested a cleanup operation consistent with attempting to destroy materials that might contain incriminating evidence. Anderson obtained search warrants for Morgan's property and financial records. The financial investigation revealed that Morgan had made several large cash deposits to his bank accounts during 1991 and 1992, far exceeding what his documented income would support. When questioned about the source of these funds during a voluntary interview, Morgan claimed they represented savings from his business sale to Hayes, though the amounts didn't align with the documented sale price. During this interview, conducted at the sheriff's department, Morgan maintained that he had left the honey distribution business because of ethical concerns about Hayes's practices. He claimed to have discovered that Hayes was adulterating honey products and had decided to distance himself from the operation before legal consequences ensued. Morgan insisted he had no knowledge of Samuel Thompson's disappearance beyond what had been reported in the news at the time. However, Anderson noticed inconsistencies in Morgan's account. He claimed to have sold his business share in January 1991, yet bank records showed significant transactions between Morgan and Hayes continuing through mid-1992. Phone records from the early 1990s, painstakingly retrieved from archived telephone company records, showed frequent calls between Morgan and Hayes during the weeks immediately following Samuel's disappearance. The detective also discovered that Morgan had purchased property in South Carolina in late 1990, paying cash for a substantial down payment that represented far more money than his income and business sale proceeds should have provided. The timing suggested that Morgan had come into unexpected money shortly after Samuel disappeared. Anderson presented her accumulated evidence to the district attorney's office. Prosecutors reviewed the case materials, including the documentary evidence preserved by the bees, the financial irregularities, the witness statements, and the forensic findings from the cabin. They determined that while the evidence against Hayes was substantial, building a case against Morgan would require additional testimony or documentary proof of his direct involvement in Samuel's death. The break came from an unexpected source. Investigators discovered a storage unit that had belonged to Christopher Hayes, its rental payments automated through a bank account that continued making withdrawals even after his death. The unit had gone unnoticed during the settlement of Hayes's estate because the payments were automatic and the unit was registered under a business name that no longer existed. Inside the storage unit, investigators found boxes of business records that Hayes had apparently saved despite closing his company decades earlier. Among these papers were handwritten notes detailing the honey adulteration scheme, including calculations showing how much profit could be generated by mixing genuine honey with cheaper corn syrup and imported products. More significantly, the notes included references to Samuel Thompson as a threat to the operation. Hayes had documented conversations with Morgan about how to handle the situation, including explicit discussions about needing to prevent Samuel from reporting their activities to authorities. While the notes stopped short of directly describing murder, they established that both Hayes and Morgan had viewed Samuel as an obstacle that needed to be eliminated. One particularly damning document was a letter from Morgan to Hayes, dated 2 weeks after Samuel's disappearance, referencing their need to maintain silence about their business arrangement and warning Hayes to destroy any documentation that could connect them to the supplier fraud. The letter's language, while carefully avoiding direct admission of criminal activity, strongly implied shared guilt in matters beyond simple business fraud. Armed with this additional evidence, prosecutors felt confident proceeding with charges against Patrick Morgan. In January 2024, Anderson traveled to South Carolina with a warrant for Morgan's arrest. He was taken into custody without incident, appearing shocked that events from more than 3 decades earlier had finally caught up with him. Morgan was extradited to North Carolina to face charges of conspiracy to commit murder, felony murder, obstruction of justice, and fraud. The indictment detailed how Morgan and Hayes had lured Samuel to the remote cabin under the pretense of negotiating a resolution to his concerns about their business practices, then killed him to prevent him from exposing their fraudulent operation. As Morgan sat in the Buncombe County Jail awaiting trial, Detective Anderson reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had finally brought the case to resolution. A beekeeper's careful attention to unusual details, a colony of insects that had inadvertently preserved crucial evidence, and persistent detective work across 3 decades had combined to pierce the silence that had protected Samuel Thompson's killers for so long. Yet questions remained about exactly what had transpired in that cabin on the day Samuel died, questions that could only be answered by someone who had been present. Whether Patrick Morgan would choose to provide those answers or maintain his denial would determine how completely the truth about April 1990 would finally be known. Spring 2024, Asheville, North Carolina. The trial of Patrick Morgan commenced in March 2024, drawing significant media attention as a decades-old mystery finally reached its resolution. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Margaret Chen, faced the challenge of convincing a jury based on evidence that had aged along with the case itself, preserved by circumstances that seemed almost impossible to believe. The trial opened with testimony from David Mitchell, the beekeeper whose attention to unusual details had initiated the investigation. He described the discovery of the hive and the objects sealed within it, explaining how his experience had told him that something about the scene warranted law enforcement attention. His credibility as an expert witness established the foundation for introducing the physical evidence that followed. Forensic specialists testified about the process of extracting and analyzing the items preserved in the honeycomb. Jennifer Martinez walked the jury through her examination of the watch, the clothing fragments, and most significantly, the documents that Samuel Thompson had been compiling about the honey fraud operation. The preservation of these materials in beeswax, she explained, had protected them from degradation that would normally destroy evidence over such a long time period. Catherine Thompson, now 81 years old, provided emotional testimony about her husband's character, his dedication to honest business practices, and the devastating impact his disappearance had on their family. She identified the watch as the one she had given Samuel and confirmed that the handwriting on the documents matched his distinctive style. Her testimony humanized the victim for jurors who had not been born when Samuel disappeared. Michael and Emily Thompson also testified, describing how growing up without their father had shaped their lives and careers. Michael's work as an investigative journalist and Emily's dedication to supporting families of missing persons both stemmed directly from their experience of unresolved loss. Their testimony emphasized the long-term consequences of the crime Morgan was accused of committing. The prosecution presented the financial evidence demonstrating Morgan's unexplained wealth acquisition immediately following Samuel's disappearance. Bank records, property purchases, and the timeline of his departure from the honey business all supported the theory that Morgan had profited from eliminating Samuel as a threat to the fraudulent operation he ran with Christopher Hayes. The documents discovered in Hayes' storage unit proved particularly damaging. Prosecutors used them to establish the conspiracy between Hayes and Morgan to silence Samuel permanently. While the notes never explicitly stated that murder was planned, the language about eliminating threats and preventing exposure created a clear picture of two men who viewed homicide as a solution to their business problem. The medical examiner testified about the skeletal remains and cause of death. The blunt force trauma to Samuel's skull indicated he had been struck with significant force, likely resulting in immediate or rapid death. The shallow burial beneath the cabin suggested the killers had not anticipated their crime remaining undiscovered for decades, relying instead on the remote location to prevent the body from being found. Morgan's defense attorney attempted to cast doubt on the prosecution's timeline and to suggest that Hayes alone had been responsible for Samuel's death. The defense argued that Morgan had left the business because he discovered Hayes's criminal activities, not because he had participated in murder. The defense characterized the financial evidence as circumstantial and suggested that Morgan's legitimate business activities could explain his economic improvement in the early 1990s. However, the defense struggled to explain several key pieces of evidence. The letter from Morgan to Hayes discussing their need to maintain silence could not easily be reconciled with Morgan's claim that he had distanced himself from Hayes's criminal enterprise. The timing of Morgan's sudden wealth acquisition immediately after Samuel's disappearance created a connection that the defense could challenge but not definitively break. The prosecution called former associates of both Hayes and Morgan who testified about the partnership between the two men and their joint operation of the honey distribution business. Several witnesses described Morgan as an equal partner in business decisions, contradicting his characterization of himself as a passive participant who had been unaware of Hayes's criminal activities. In a calculated decision, the defense chose not to have Morgan testify, recognizing that his account of events would be subjected to cross-examination that could expose inconsistencies and admissions damaging to his case. This decision likely spared Morgan from direct contradiction, but also prevented the jury from hearing his explanation for the evidence arrayed against him. Closing arguments occupied an entire day. The prosecution emphasized the accumulation of evidence, the physical items connecting Morgan to Samuel's death, the financial records showing his profit from the crime, the documentary evidence establishing conspiracy, and the testimony of witnesses who had known both men during the relevant period. District Attorney Chen reminded jurors that the extraordinary preservation of evidence by the bees had provided them with proof that would normally have been lost to time, proof they should not ignore simply because it had survived through unusual means. The defense argued that reasonable doubt existed, that Hayes could have acted alone, and that the passage of time made certainty impossible. The defense attorney acknowledged that Morgan had been involved in business fraud, but maintained that fraud was not murder, and that the prosecution had not definitively proven Morgan's presence at the cabin when Samuel died. The jury deliberated for 3 days, reviewing the extensive evidence and testimony presented during the 2-week trial. On April 18, 2024, exactly 34 years and 4 days after Samuel Thompson disappeared from the Asheville city market, the jury returned its verdict. Patrick Morgan was found guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit murder, felony murder committed during the course of another felony, obstruction of justice, and multiple counts of fraud. Sentencing occurred 2 weeks later. The judge heard victim impact statements from Catherine, Michael, and Emily Thompson, each describing the decades of uncertainty and pain that Morgan's actions had caused. The judge noted the particularly cruel nature of allowing a family to suffer without answers for more than 3 decades, denying them even the basic human dignity of being able to properly mourn their loved one. Patrick Morgan received a sentence of 25 years in prison for the murder-related charges, to be served consecutively with additional time for obstruction and fraud. At 68 years old, the sentence effectively meant Morgan would spend the remainder of his life incarcerated, a measure of justice that arrived far later than anyone would have preferred, but that finally closed a case that had haunted a family and a community for more than 3 decades. The Thompson family held a memorial service for Samuel in May 2024, finally able to lay his remains to rest with the ceremony and recognition he deserved. The service drew attendees from across the region, including beekeepers, market vendors who had known Samuel, and representatives from agricultural organizations who honored his integrity in business. David Mitchell attended the service, having developed a relationship with the Thompson family during the investigation and trial. His role in discovering the evidence that solved Samuel's disappearance had transformed a routine service call into a contribution to justice that would define his career. The case prompted discussions about cold case investigations and the importance of preserving evidence even when immediate resolution seems impossible. The Asheville Police Department used the Thompson case as a training example, demonstrating how seemingly insignificant details and persistent investigation could eventually break cases that appeared permanently unsolved. Catherine Thompson, speaking to media after the sentencing, expressed gratitude for everyone who had contributed to solving her husband's disappearance. She acknowledged that justice had taken far too long, but emphasized that knowing the truth provided a form of peace that 3 decades of uncertainty had denied her family. The honey business she had maintained in Samuel's memory would continue, she announced, now as a tribute to his integrity rather than a vigil for his return. The extraordinary circumstances of the case, evidence preserved by bees in wax for 33 years, attracted attention from forensic scientists interested in unusual preservation environments. The Thompson case became a reference point in discussions about how evidence could survive in unexpected ways and why investigators should remain open to unconventional sources of information. As the calendar moved past the anniversary of Samuel's disappearance, the Thompson family faced their first spring in 34 years, with answers rather than questions. The man who had vanished from the market on an April afternoon in 1990 had finally been found, his story told, and his killer brought to justice. The truth had been preserved in the most unlikely of archives, sealed in wax and honey, waiting patiently for the day when someone with the knowledge to recognize its significance would finally set it free.